Hey everybody, this is Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to be doing our very first VOD review of viewer submitted gameplay video. So let's jump right into it. And for our very first VOD, we have viewer Plasma48 on the map Sun City. Sun City is a relatively interesting map. B ends up being a little bit of a skirmish, although it can sometimes be hard to cross from B to A or C due to some very prominent sight lines. C is generally the side that is the lightest, whereas you don't usually get a lot of enemies on that side of the map. A tends to be the heaviest as it's more of the default spawn for this map for at least both sides. So generally speaking, if you want more activity, you should go to A. If you want more flanking opportunities, you go C side. B ends up being a little weird where you have to be fairly familiar with the sight lines to really make the best use of it. So right off the bat, we're looking at the lineup and we actually have two problems, one of which is a much bigger problem than the other. The first and most notable problem is the improved chaparral, which is 10.3. The entire rest of the lineup is 9.3 and below. So you're pulling your whole lineup into 10.3 matches just for an anti-air, and the chaparral, while not completely unusable, really isn't a 10.3. It's more like a 9.7 AA. And I've noticed anecdotally that at about 10.3 you tend to get pulled up into a lot of 10.7 and 11.0 matches fairly often, which this lineup isn't that well suited to deal with. It's not completely incompetent, but it's not exactly what I would call my preferred setup. On top of that, you do have a pretty good anti-air in the Macbeth around this battle rating. Well, pretty good's probably a stretch, but the Macbeth generally works at 9.3 exactly. You can't really push it that much higher, but there's not really a compelling reason to go up into a higher battle rating bracket just to get a slightly better anti-air. The Zoklum Togger is also a pretty questionable pick, as you have the Giraffe and you also have access to some other picks around this battle rating, so I would probably drop that. One of the more interesting ideas that you could do to replace the Zoklum Tiger would actually be the ZSU 57-2. The ZSU 57-2 has fairly decent mobility, and the fast-firing cannons that have about 150 millimeters of penetration with their APHE shell can kind of shred anything in the game from the side, and quite a few enemies around this battle rating you can shred from the front as well. So it does give the list a little bit more legs than it would normally have, although something like the Giraffe is perfectly fine. At the end of the day, Zoklum Togger, you don't really have to take it out if you don't need to, but there are better options and options that might actually serve you better in specific situations as opposed to right now where it's just kind of a throwaway slot. Everything else is perfectly fine. The Merkava 1B, the Merkava 2B, these are both excellent picks. I assume the reason why you have the Magok 6B Gal and the Shotcow Gimel is because you didn't go all the way up the Magok line, which is perfectly fine. It doesn't really get you anywhere beyond a certain point anyway. And of course, the Yeet is actually a pretty awesome cast option, so I can't fault you for that either. The rest of this lineup is perfectly fine. I just think the Chaparral is dragging it down a lot. The ammo loading you have is giving me a bit of a mild stroke here, but ammo loading tends to be kind of subjective anyway. The M413 shell is a pretty solid option and it should be your default shell. However, 22 rounds is a bit of an odd number. I probably wouldn't take more than 18 or 20. The Heat FS round M152, you have exactly one of them, and I think that might be an error. I would never advise taking exactly one of a shell. If it's worth taking one, it's typically worth taking two. Even something like the smoke round, which you're currently taking 0 of. And if memory serves, the Merkava 1B and 2B actually have a Hesh round. I find the Hesh round is a lot more useful in specific situations than Heat FS round, especially if you see lightly armored enemies. So I would probably go something more like 18 of the M413 shell, 2 of the Hesh shell, or 2 or 3 of the Hesh shell, and then 2 smoke shells. I feel like that would be a much better loadout. It's not that this loadout is specifically bad, but you don't have any of the situational shells that the 105mm kind of benefits from, because the 105 L7 does have a pretty good suite of situational ammo types that can be really useful in specific areas. So we're taking the Merkava 2B out on the far left side of the map on Sun City. There's not a lot of horizontal cover on this side of the map, and horizontal cover tends to be where the Merkavas excel a little bit more. You have basically nothing but vertical cover like buildings and stuff like that. So the problem with this part of the map is that essentially you're going to have to find a lot of ways to go around these corners without exposing driver, engine, getting immobilized where you can't return fire, all that stuff. It's not impossible, but it can be a little dodgy, especially depending on how much ammo you have. The ammo bends in the back left and right may be filled with ammo, so if you angle a little bit too much, opponents can put rounds into the back of the vehicle and actually cause ammo explosions, which is a bit of a pain to worry about. on the whole, with this kind of tank, I would broadly prefer like the middle of the map or possibly even seaside, because that provides you with a lot more like corners. It'll provide you with a lot more like horizontal terrain that you can kind of work around. And as we get up to this corner, we see that 2 of our teammates just got taken out, one by a 2S38 and one by a Leopard 2A4, a Hungarian one specifically. That's not exactly the best setup to be driving up into, especially because the 2S38 can kind of shred you to pieces, and the Leopard 2A4 can be a little inconsistent to kill or disable in one shot. So if you know both of them are there together, potentially even if you knock out one, you probably just die to the other. So we'll see how you take this situation. Okay, so in this situation, I'm not entirely sure where you thought the 2A4 and the 2S38 were. If you really thought they were on the right-hand side but didn't know for sure, I would probably just avoid taking the corner at all, or try to side scrape off of the corner on your side to make sure that they're not just going to come around the left-hand side. But it feels like you should have been able to snap a shot at that 2A4 because he didn't exactly fly around the corner and immediately vaporize you. It actually took him a second to line that one up. So that felt like that should have been a very winnable fight, but it just seemed like you were expecting the enemy to appear from a different direction. And this is also one of the principles, is if you don't specifically know where the enemy is and you know there are multiple enemies in the area, it can sometimes be a good idea to simply wait a second and see if they reveal themselves, or take a position where you only have to worry about one enemy appearing at a time. For example, if you had simply stayed at the corner to the back, now the enemies can only appear from that corner unless they just completely wrap around the right-hand side and get your teammates as well. Second verse, same as the first, so now we're taking the 1B, same ammo load as before, same general critique of that. We're taking them to the exact same corner. Neither the Leopard 2A4 nor the 2S38 has appeared in the kill feed yet, so we know they're probably still in that area. Somebody went to A, it could have been them, could have been somebody else. It's kind of a coin flip. So the question is, how do you take this corner now that you know for a fact the enemy is there? That certainly was a fight. Out of all of the fights, that was definitely one of them. So the shot to the Fuji wasn't actually bad, it's just some reason only got the commander. I think there was some spalling issues with that, because in theory a shot there should have also gotten the gunner and knocked him out. Fortunately, the Fuji really had some potato aim and somehow couldn't disable your gun. I'm not really sure what was going on with that, but overall I think you made the right call to go for the barrel and then deal with the Frekia. The Frekia obviously had some issues with the spike not being able to lock you. At this range, it's not unreasonable. And of course, the Frekia's gun couldn't really damage you. It looked like he was having some trouble getting your barrel, but you kept it moving enough that he couldn't like reliably scope it in. So while I do think there were definitely some good plays on your part, that kind of 2v1 shouldn't be possible most of the time. And it probably should have been a, you hit the Fuji and then you immediately try to back up out of the scenario, although the 1B doesn't have the best reverse gear. Overall, that's a 2v1, and again, a 2v1 shouldn't really be winnable, and in this case it wasn't, but you had good enough reaction to at least get one of them on the way out. But again, that's another one of those behind every clutch is a throw. You shouldn't expect to survive long enough to get a kill in that scenario, especially if you're getting shot in the side and you're already down a crew member. So a shot basically right underneath the turret should get at least the other two pretty easily. But that's about as good as you could expect in that scenario. Sometimes you just kind of get surrounded and there's not much else you can really do about it. This is also where awareness of team positioning helps to kind of not get surrounded, although realistically you don't have a ton of team members on the map in general, so at that point you just kind of have to hope you don't run into multiple enemies at a time, which you did twice in a row, and when you don't have a team, there's not really much you can do when that happens. And here we're rolling into the Yeet. The Yeet has triple Mavericks, double Walleyes, double AIM-9Ds. Hold on, let me check him in on this. Yeah, like the Yeet has the Shafrir 2s. You should definitely be using those over the AIM-9Ds. They're effectively the same spawn cost, and in the vast majority of cases, they're just objectively better. But I could certainly understand if those weren't exactly the highest priority to research, since the AIM-9Ds do fill a very similar role in a lot of situations. Given the A4's tendency to break its wings off, I generally wouldn't recommend that type of roll before an attack run because you have a bad tendency to just basically get a wing overload crash or rip one of your wings off, especially with a particularly heavy ordnance loadout. Ultimately, it looked like you got a little spooked by the RWR warning, but it didn't look like the enemy had any anti-air up, so it was probably a friendly like the MiG-21 and F that just could be ignored. Target selection was fine, getting 2 hits with the Mavericks is fine. Mavericks not killing targets just kind of happens for some reason, but overall, pretty good attack run. Ultimately, your teammates aren't specifically requesting help in any areas, and there aren't any major points on the map that you need to be focusing on, so just catching some enemies off of spawn going towards A is probably fine. Fire a Maverick at a dead enemy and then get shot down by an enemy plane behind you seems reasonable. Definitely had that happen a few times before. In this case, like the RWR warning was clearly not coming from a friendly, so you probably should have paid a little more attention to it because the RWR warning also wasn't coming from the enemy. It would have been more in the forward arc. So I definitely would have kind of canceled the attack run and went to see what was trying to engage me at that point, but it is what it is.
Enemy spotted.
So we're spawning in the Chaparral to take out the AMX. Nothing really wrong with spawning an anti-air to take out an air, especially at this point it looks like the map's basically won. So if you spawn on a ground vehicle, there's a lot of driving, probably isn't going to get you anywhere. However, you do switch spawns, and I don't really agree with that, because as you can kind of tell just by how much you're having to work to get a line of sight, this spawn actually has really bad LOS to air targets because you have a giant building in front of you, you have big buildings between you and both their air and heli spawns, and you also have some big buildings off to the left. It's actually the worst spawn to try and engage most air threats from, whereas the other spawn you only have some basic one-story buildings around you, so it's a lot easier to shoot from. But other than that, pretty textbook engagement. There's no reason not to shoot a second missile. You're late in the map, you have plenty of them anyways with the Chaparral, so the rest of the engagement is fine. I just found the spawn switch to be a little weird. And that wraps up the map. 4 ground targets destroyed, 1 air target, 3 deaths. Nothing wrong with a game like this. I feel like if you watch nothing but YouTuber games, you can get the feeling you have to get like 10 kills every game. A game like this is perfectly fine, especially if you're trying to grind or go up a tech tree, and this is better than what your average player is going to do in a given match. As an interesting note, which is kind of what I was talking about at the very beginning with the lineup, the Frekia is 10.3, as is the AMX, so if you're playing the full 9.3 lineup, you don't even have to worry about fighting those two vehicles all that often because it would be a max up tier, and on top of that, the Fuji is an 11.0, you wouldn't have to fight it at all. It's not like those vehicles were the biggest problem in the world, but you definitely make your life easier by playing 9.3, especially because you get down tiers more often, so unless you're specifically looking at the silver bonus you get for taking out enemies of a higher BR, I definitely would drop the Chaparral. And that wraps up the VOD review. If you guys like this and you want to see more of it, make sure to let me know down in the comments below. And of course, subscribing always helps out the channel. Additionally, if you have a VOD that you would like me to look over, just feel free to drop that in the comments and I'll make sure to check it out. As always, don't commit to shoes.